Before the story begins, if you're listening on YouTube, tap that like button so the algorithm doesn't hunt this tale into extinction. Drop a comment about your favorite alien species, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter drifting in on the solar winds. Rylan Hayes watched the broadcast ripple across the comm wall of the frontier outpost, each word spreading through the room like a quiet detonation. A bounty announcement, system-wide, stamped with Tri-Solar Authority priority. The Varkel was officially marked as the most dangerous living entity within 3 suns, accused of erasing colonies and leaving only silence behind. The room buzzed with the restless friction of opportunists smelling reward. Rylan felt the tension roll over him like dry thunder, but he didn't share the mercenaries' hunger. His curiosity ran deeper, shaped by years of studying creatures most people would never dare approach. He leaned closer as the hologram unfurled a rotating image, a towering silhouette with blade-shaped limbs and obsidian plates that shimmered like cooled volcanic glass. The voiceover promised a fortune large enough to buy a moonlet outright. Every mercenary guild within light minutes surged to action. They sprinted toward their ships, armor half-latched, teeth bared in anticipation of the hunt. Rylan wasn't part of their world, though he often wandered beside its borders. He came to the Tri-Solar frontier to map migration patterns across the scorched moons and catalog species that defied biological logic. He came to avoid people convinced violence was the universe's only language. Yet the Varkel's projected figure etched itself into his mind with a strange pull. Something about its posture, the tilt of the head, the defensive curve of its frame. Predators didn't usually look cornered. He shut off the broadcast and stared out at the cracked dunes beyond the outpost shielding. The third sun hovered low, bleeding molten color into the desert and carving long black scars of shadow between ridges. He hadn't intended to leave the station tonight. But Discovery often refused to wait for convenience, and the displacement patterns he'd been tracking for days tugged at him now with a newly sharp edge. They matched the broadcast's hunt routes a little too closely. Within minutes he was aboard his skiff, gliding over the blistered terrain while sand hissed along the hull. He pushed the engine harder than he usually dared, driven by a sense that something alive and intelligent was out there, pushing back against forces larger than itself. When he reached the northern crescent of dunes, his scanners began to twitch. Heat signatures clustered beneath the surface like moving embers. He powered down the skiff and let the hush of the desert settle around him. The triple sun sky breathed heat waves that shimmered in the air, bending distance into mirage. He walked the last stretch on foot, boots crunching across the crusted ground. The scanner ping grew sharper, pulsing as he neared a fissure in the terrain. Fine black dust drifted upward in soft plumes. Something had passed through here recently, leaving a trail of fractured stone and faint scratches that looked almost like writing or warning. Rylan knelt, tracing a claw mark with his glove. Its precision surprised him. Not the wild swipe of a beast. More like deliberate placement. A vibration rippled through the earth before he heard anything. The air shifted, carrying a heavy presence that settled on his skin like pressure. He rose slowly, turning just as a dark shape emerged from the split rock. It stepped into the light with the slow, weighted grace of a creature calculating every possible outcome at once. The Varkel stood less than 30 paces away. Its plates caught the sunlight in streaks of molten silver. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, ichor seeping between the fractures. Its breathing came slow, deliberate, almost meditative despite its injuries. Those eyes, deep and reflective, studied him with an intelligence that made Rylan still his own breath. He lifted both hands in a calm, non-threatening gesture. Instinct told him that fleeing would trigger pursuit. Speaking felt equally reckless. So he held the silence with the fragile patience of a man hoping not to shatter the air between them. The creature shifted its weight, not forward but sideways, as though positioning itself to monitor both Rylan and the horizon behind him. That detail lodged in Rylan's mind. Predators didn't track threats behind strangers. They tracked threats stalking them. A low roar split the sky. Dropships streaked in, leaving contrails that scratched across the light. Mercenaries were minutes away, maybe less. Rylan looked back at the Varkel, whose jaw flexed with restrained pain and something sharper than fear. Resolve, perhaps. Or exhaustion worn thin. "Are they hunting you?" Rylan whispered. "Or chasing a lie?" The creature's gaze locked onto his, and for a moment the desert felt suspended. A pulse, more sensed than heard, washed over him like the echo of a thought pressed against his awareness. Not words. Not emotion. More like intent brushing the edge of comprehension. He didn't know what it meant, but it was not the intent of a mindless killer. Dust gusted across the dunes as the first dropship broke the sound barrier. The ground trembled with hydraulic landing gear. Ryland didn't need training in combat to understand the stakes. The mercenaries would shoot first and dissect later. They wouldn't care what the creature wanted or why it had run. He stepped back but not to flee. He positioned himself between the Varkel and the incoming mercenary squad, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe the desert heat had baked his sanity. Maybe the pulse he'd felt was some primitive bridge forming between two beings caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe he simply trusted the quiet logic he read in the creature's stance. The Varkel shifted again, plates flaring subtly as though considering whether to retreat or defend. Ryland didn't move, placing a hand lightly against the fissured stone beside him to keep balance as the wind from the landing dropship whipped around him. Mercenaries poured out in formation, weapons drawn, visors gleaming. One pointed directly at Ryland. "Step aside, human. That thing's worth enough to retire 10 times over." Ryland didn't. His voice came steady, even as adrenaline tightened every muscle. "You've got the wrong story." The mercenary laughed. "Credits don't care about stories." The Varkel made a low sound that thrummed through the sand like a living tremor. Not a threat. A warning. The mercenaries tightened their grip. Ryland felt the moment stretch into something fragile and irreversible. The creature behind him was wounded. The mercenaries in front of him were ready to kill. He had no weapon, no leverage, no reason to stand his ground, except the growing certainty that the galaxy's most feared predator was not the monster in this confrontation. A second dropship roared overhead, casting their shadows long and sharp across the dunes. The tension became a living thing poised to snap. Ryland squared his shoulders, pulse hammering as the mercenaries advanced. And the Varkel stepped forward behind him. The Varkel's advance reshaped the moment. It loomed with a quiet, deliberate strength, no longer just a silhouette against the dunes but a wounded sovereign standing its ground. The mercenaries faltered, their bravado cracking at the edges as the creature angled its uninjured arm toward them like a drawn blade. Ryland could feel its presence behind him, dense as gravity. Every instinct told him to run, yet another instinct, something older and more abstract, urged him to hold steady. The Varkel wasn't preparing to strike him. It was bracing to shield him. The lead mercenary's helmet snapped toward Ryland. "Move or we drop both of you." "I'm not moving." The words escaped before reason could throttle them. His voice sounded strangely sure, as though spoken by a version of himself built for braver moments. A crack of tension rippled through the air. The Varkel released a sound unlike any Ryland had heard before, a harmonic vibration that resonated in his ribs. It felt like a command carried on instinct rather than language. Dust spiraled around the creature's feet as its plates shifted into a guarded formation. The mercenaries raised their rifles. Ryland reacted faster than he imagined himself capable of, grabbing a flare charge from his belt and slamming it against the ground. White heat billowed in a blistering arc, forcing the nearest mercenaries to stumble back. It bought only seconds, but seconds were currency in a chase like this. "Go!" he hissed without knowing whether the Varkel would understand. A warm pulse nudged at the edge of his consciousness. Understanding swept through him like an afterimage. The creature didn't need words to comprehend urgency. It gripped his arm with surprising gentleness and pulled him toward the narrowing fissure behind them. The stone swallowed them both as weapons fire began raining across the dunes. The passage was tight enough that the Varkel had to angle its body to fit, its fractured limb dragging lightly along the rock. Ryland stumbled over jagged stone, blinking away the flare's afterglow. Heat radiated through the walls, fed by subterranean vents that throbbed beneath the moon's crust. Shadows stretched like living tendrils around them, punctuated by the Varkel's bioluminescent pulses that brightened and dimmed with its breathing. He forced himself to keep pace. "You chose not to fight them." Another pulse brushed against his thoughts. A cool, deliberate sensation lingered in its wake, neither hostile nor panicked. The Varkel was calculating. And wounded. And, to his disbelief, wary of causing unnecessary harm. Ryland steadied his breath and focused on movement. The quake of explosions above signaled that mercenaries were already deploying seismic drills to widen the fissure. They were relentless and heavily funded. No one pursued a bounty this aggressively unless someone powerful demanded silence as much as capture. The tunnel opened into a chamber rippled with mineral formations that glowed faintly blue. The Varkel paused, leaning into the wall with a tremor that betrayed the depth of its injury. Thick ichor dripped between its plates, each drop sizzling slightly against the warm stone. Ryland approached slowly, hands visible, careful not to betray alarm. "If you collapse here, they'll reach us in minutes." The creature's gaze flickered with a dim inner light. Another pulse. This one sharper. He glimpsed fractured impressions in the back of his mind. Containment grids, mercenary insignias, surgical restraints. Not language. Memory. Trauma carried by instinctual echo. He swallowed. So they hurt you first. The Varkel responded with a faint lift of its chin, an acknowledgement wrapped in exhaustion. Ryland scanned the creature's wounds. The armor plating was compromised along the shoulder and down one side of its chest. He dug through his field kit, retrieving sealant, microfoam, and a stabilizer patch normally used on large fauna. He doubted the patch was calibrated for something this size, but in the absence of a better miracle, he worked quickly. He approached with slow, deliberate movements. I'm going to help you. If this stings, don't crush me. The Varkel's plates shifted, exposing the injured area with cautious trust. Ryland applied the sealant, watching it react instantly with the ichor, hardening into a protective lattice. The creature exhaled in a controlled, rumbling rhythm, as though resisting the urge to recoil. You're holding together, he murmured. Barely, but holding. A sound like a subdued growl rippled from the creature's chest. Not anger. Not pain. Acceptance. The chamber trembled. Dust rained down from above. Mercenaries were getting closer. Ryland tightened his pack. We can't stay here. If we move deeper, the geothermal shafts might hide our trail. The Varkel straightened with effort, towering once more above him. It stepped past him and tapped a claw lightly against the ground, leaving a precise mark. A direction. A plan. You know this terrain, Ryland realized. You've been navigating the fissures. The creature's pulse of acknowledgement surged through him with more clarity than before. The link was strengthening, as though its mind recognized his intent and shaped its communication accordingly. They descended through a narrow passageway that plunged into darkness. The air grew hotter, thrumming with the heartbeat of the moon. The silence between them felt purposeful rather than strained. Two beings, bound by circumstance, threading their way through a labyrinth built by ancient pressure and time. Behind them, muffled shouts echoed faintly. The mercenaries had reached the outer chamber. Ryland glanced back only once. They won't stop. The Varkel emitted a low resonance, one that carried fatigue and something heavier beneath it, resolve sharpened by desperation. The tunnel widened into a sloping corridor lined with shimmering crystal veins. Ryland realized they were approaching geothermal flows. Dangerous terrain, but ideal for masking movement. He stepped alongside the creature, no longer trailing behind. If we survive this, I want the truth. About you. About all of this. A pulse flickered in response. Not refusal. Not agreement. A promise withheld until safety found them. The ground shook violently, urging them onward. Heat washed over them as a curtain of steam erupted from a side vent. Ryland shielded his face. When the vapor thinned, the Varkel stood ahead of him, silhouetted in the glow of molten light, poised and alert despite its wounds. It looked back at him, eyes reflecting the fire below, and Ryland understood the unspoken message. Their escape had just begun. The molten glow rising from the geothermal shafts cast shifting bands of light along the tunnel walls, carving the Varkel into a silhouette that seemed sculpted from living stone. Ryland followed closely, each step measured against the uneven terrain. The heat pressed against his lungs, turning every breath into effort, yet the creature ahead moved with a wounded dignity that refused surrender. They pushed deeper until the passage split into two descending corridors. The Varkel paused, considering the routes with a slow tilt of its head. A faint pulse brushed Ryland's mind again, a nudge of instinct rather than thought, guiding him toward the left path. The right side hummed with vibrations he could barely perceive, a sign the mercenaries were driving seismic drills into the moon's crust with reckless ambition. Ryland adjusted his strap and kept close enough to catch the creature if it faltered. They won't stop until they've torn this moon apart, he said, voice low. Someone wants you erased, not captured. The Varkel answered with a muted resonance that traveled through the stone beneath them. Ryland sensed the meaning even without clear interpretation. Yes. Pursued without mercy. Targeted without truth. The tunnel expanded into a chamber lit by ribbons of molten or flowing through fractures in the floor. Ancient structures, half fused with the rock, jutted from the walls like forgotten ribs of some colossal beast. Ryland brushed a smooth panel embedded in the stone. The symbols etched across it were too deliberate to be natural. These ruins aren't on any chart, he whispered. You've been here before, haven't you? The Varkel stepped forward, touching one claw gently to a series of symbols. The stone pulsed briefly, reacting to its presence. A cascade of impressions surged into Ryland's mind, Containment grids snapping shut, sterile lights, the cold precision of machines dissecting living flesh. Then the creatures escape, violent, desperate, fueled by pure survival. Ryland staggered and grabbed the wall, chest tight. Those weren't crimes. Those were experiments. They created the story that you destroyed colonies. The creature's plates tightened and a deep vibration rolled through its frame. Not aggression. Grief tempered with fury. They lied, Ryland murmured. They used you, then hunted you when you survived. For the first time, the Varkel turned fully toward him, its gaze steady and unshielded. In that gaze, Ryland saw the burdens of an apex hunter forced to run like prey. He saw resolve hardening into something that resembled trust. A distant explosion rattled the chamber. Dust drifted from the ceiling in ominous spirals. They're coming from both sides now, Ryland said. If we stay in open caverns, they'll corner us. The Varkel extended its good arm, pointing toward a narrow crevice partially sealed by fractured stone. Ryland squeezed through first, finding himself in a series of interconnected tunnels that zigzagged in unpredictable angles, carved long before modern civilizations touched these moons. The Varkel followed, its bulk maneuvering through with surprising agility. They wove through twisting paths until the air grew cooler and the tremors softened. Ryland exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. We bought some time. Yet time grew thinner with every step. Ahead lay a chamber with a floor of polished basalt encircled by mineral columns. Ryland felt an uncanny calm here, as if the moon's ancient architects had carved sanctuaries for those who listened rather than conquered. The Varkel reached the center and lowered itself slowly, bracing its injured limb. Ryland rushed forward, kneeling beside it. You need to rest, but not for long. Tell me how far your crash site is. If we can reach it. He stopped. The creature's pulse pressed against his mind again, more coherent this time. He felt a flicker of imagery, a northern plateau rising from ash plains, a starpod buried beneath collapsed stone, evidence sealed within. So there was proof. Proof that the mercenaries were hiding their crimes, proof that the bounty was theater crafted to mask atrocities. If we get there, Ryland said, the authority can't ignore the truth. They'll see what was done to you. The Varkel inclined its head, and a faint glow rippled along its plates. The chamber lights flickered as a volley of seismic waves shook the tunnels. Ryland scrambled to his feet, scanning for exits. A thin fissure high on the wall let in a draft. Fresh air. That meant the surface was close enough to reach, but exposed enough to risk ambush. We don't have a choice, he said. They're too close. The Varkel rose with effort, leaning into the column for balance. Ryland offered his shoulder, though the creature barely needed the gesture. Still, it accepted, and that acceptance felt like a quiet alliance forming in the boiling darkness. He guided the creature toward a sloped tunnel that angled upward. The temperature dropped sharply as they climbed, the geothermal glow fading behind them. Wind seeped through cracks above, carrying the metallic scent of ash plains and open sky. A sudden tremor shook the slope. Ryland braced against the wall as stones rained down. The Varkel shielded him with its good arm, plates interlocking with an audible grind. When the shaking subsided, the creature lowered its arm and Ryland gave a breathless nod of thanks. They reached a break in the rock ceiling. Slivers of pale light speared through. Ryland climbed first, hauling himself onto a ledge overlooking a vast expanse of volcanic soil. 3 suns hung at different heights, diffusing harsh radiance across the plains. He offered his hand. The Varkel pushed itself upward, emerging into the blistering brightness. For a moment, it stood fully in the light, its form immense and defiant against the horizon. Ryland scanned the distance. No mercenary skiffs yet. But they would follow the cleared tunnels soon enough. Whoever commanded them had resources to burn and patience sharpened to cruelty. We head north, Ryland said. Fast. The Varkel's gaze swept the plains, lingering on a distant ridge line that matched the memory it had shared. It took the first step, its stride steady despite its injuries. Ryland fell into pace beside it, feeling the heat from the ground vibrate up through his boots. Behind them, the fissure coughed a plume of dust as echoes of pursuit shuddered from below. Ryland didn't look back. The horizon in front of them held answers, danger, and a truth powerful enough to set entire sectors trembling. The Varkel let out a low, resonant sound, a warble woven with resolve. Ryland answered with a quiet breath. Then let's finish what they started. And together they crossed into the open plains, where survival and revelation waited in equal measure. Ash stretched in every direction, a barren ocean shimmering beneath the glare of 3 suns. Ryland kept pace beside the Varkel, each stride driven by urgency rather than stamina. The creature's breathing had steadied since the tunnels, but its wounded limbs still dragged slightly, carving a thin line across the scorched ground. Wind gathered grit and flung it across the plains in sharp waves. Ryland shielded his eyes, scanning the horizon for movement. Nothing yet. The mercenaries were slower on foot but relentless in machines. They would regroup, rearm, and sweep the plains with all the precision their funding could buy. "We'll make the plateau before they reach open ground," Ryland said. The words felt like a promise he didn't have full confidence in, but confidence wasn't what the Varkel needed. It needed direction. The creature gave a low, resonant hum that rippled through the air like affirmation. It tilted its head toward the distant ridge, jaw tightening with a silent determination that mirrored Ryland's own. They advanced into harsher terrain. Thin cracks spidered across the soil, releasing whirls of heat so intense they shimmered like glass. Ryland hopped across one fissure and nearly stumbled as a thin plume erupted beneath him. The Varkel moved instantly, catching his arm with its uninjured hand and pulling him clear of the vent's steam burst. "Thanks," Ryland muttered, breath-catching. "I'd rather not be cooked today." The creature's plates flexed in what he almost interpreted as dry amusement. Then its head snapped to the side, focusing on something far beyond Ryland's field of vision. A shadow sliced across the ground. Ryland looked up. 3 drones streaked overhead, their rotors slicing the air with a waspish whine. They hovered, scanning beams sweeping in precise, predatory arcs. "They found us already?" Ryland whispered. The Varkel crouched low, pulling him down with a single firm motion. Its plates flattened, minimizing reflection. Ryland pressed into the ash, holding his breath. The drones slid in widening circles, analyzing heat signatures and motion traces. Ryland knew they'd detect the geothermal vents easily. What he needed was a distraction before the scanners swept their position. A jagged piece of reflective basalt lay near his hand. He grasped it and waited for a pulse of wind. When it came, he flicked the shard outward. It spun in the sunlight, scattering a false glimmer across the plains. The nearest drone pivoted sharply, following the decoy light. The other 2 shifted course. Ryland cursed under his breath. That wasn't enough. The Varkel rose slightly, eyes narrowing as it assessed the drone's patterns. Then it pressed its clawed hand against the ground, digging deep into the ash until it hit the brittle crust beneath. A fracture popped open, releasing a jet of superheated steam that swallowed one drone in a flash of vapor. Its internal circuitry hissed, then melted midair. The other 2 swerved, angling toward the plume. Ryland didn't wait. "Run." They sprinted across the plains, ash kicking up behind them in ghostly spirals. The suns hammered down with merciless intensity, turning the horizon into a blurred smear of heat and distance. Ryland's lungs burned, but he kept moving, matching the creature's stride as best he could. The ridge grew closer, rising from the plains like a jagged monument. Beyond it lay the northern plateau, and somewhere beneath that plateau the truth. Behind them, a mechanical roar rolled across the plains. Mercenary skiffs burst from the fissure they had escaped. Dust plumed behind their engines and sunlight glinted off the barrels of mounted cannons. Ryland stole a glance over his shoulder. They brought half their fleet. The Varkel emitted a low, guttural sound that vibrated with defiance. Its stride lengthened despite pain, fueled by an instinct that refused capture. The ridge's incline sharpened. Ryland scrambled up the sloping basalt, gripping fissures with desperate precision. The Varkel scaled the rise with sheer force, pulling itself upward even as its wounded arm trembled. Blaster fire erupted below. Blue streaks scorched the ground around them, sending ash and rock spraying into the air. Ryland ducked behind a boulder, heart pounding in his ears. One of the skiffs veered upward, gaining altitude as it prepared a clear shot. The Varkel moved before Ryland could react. It dropped to one knee, angled its good arm, and released a brutal kinetic burst that shattered the boulder beside them. Debris exploded outward, striking the skiff's underside. The craft spiraled and crashed into the ash with a plume of smoke. The creature staggered, winded from the effort. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Ryland barked. "We're close. Save your strength." The Varkel's eyes flickered, acknowledging the logic even if instinct rebelled. They crested the ridge at last. Wind swept across the plateau, carrying cooler air mixed with volcanic dust. The land ahead flattened into a broad expanse of cracked stone. Beneath that stone, buried under collapsed debris and blackened soil, lay the starpod holding the evidence they needed. Ryland pointed. "There. That rise in the ground. The pod's under it." The Varkel stepped forward, scanning the terrain. Its plates dimmed briefly, a sign of its waning stamina. Rylan could see the tremor running along its injured limb. Every second counted. The mercenaries reached the ridge behind them with thundering engines and shouted commands. Rylan turned, assessing the distance. Not enough time to dig out the pod and escape before they arrived. A new skiff rose, leveling its cannon directly at them. Rylan's chest tightened. They were out of cover. Out of options. Out of distance. The Varkel stepped in front of him. The decision was instant, instinctive, absolute. Rylan grabbed the creature's arm. No. We need the truth, not a last stand. His mind raced. The star pod wasn't the only device buried beneath the stone. Most escape pods carried emergency beacons, ones powerful enough to pierce even the authorities' bureaucratic fog. Rylan knelt and clawed through the ash until his fingers hit metal. He uncovered a sliver of the pod's hull and found the emergency beacon port hidden beneath its scorched plating. The Varkel watched him, chest heaving. Rylan yanked the beacon. It flared to life with a piercing frequency that shot skyward like a spear of silent light. The mercenaries froze. Rylan stood, breath ragged. If the authority is listening, he said, they'll come. A cannon blast detonated to their right, showering them in shards of stone. The mercenaries regrouped, now frantic, now desperate to silence everything before the beacon reached its audience. The Varkel lowered into a defensive stance beside him. Rylan clenched his fists, eyes locked on the horizon. Help was coming. Or annihilation. Or both. But the truth now had a voice that no mercenary guild could erase. The Varkel released a quiet, resonant sound that felt like a promise. Rylan answered with a steady breath. Let them try. The emergency beacon pulsed against the ash-streaked sky, a silent scream of truth piercing the triple sun's relentless glare. Rylan crouched behind the Varkel, watching as distant shapes appeared along the horizon. Authority ships, sleek and unyielding, cutting through the heat haze with precision. For the first time in days he allowed himself a fraction of hope. The mercenaries had no choice but to confront the weight of law they had spent the moons evading. The Varkel shifted beside him, its wounded limb braced, body coiled with a quiet, terrifying power. Rylan studied it, tracing the pattern of its scarred plates, the subtle swell of muscle beneath chitin-like armor. This creature, feared across systems, had chosen him, not because of strength but because of understanding. It had sensed something in humanity that even the mercenaries failed to grasp. Courage tempered by logic, empathy balanced with resolve. A skiff roared toward them, and the mercenary pilots, faces set in hard lines, unleashed volleys of energy that scorched the ground where they had just stood. Rylan rolled aside as the Varkel's tail swept through the dust in a shockwave, deflecting one blast and knocking another skiff off its course. The creature's movements were a fluid language of survival, each strike measured, never wasted, conserving energy for what mattered most, their joint survival and the beacon's activation. Rylan's mind raced. He could see the tactical patterns forming in the mercenaries' assault. They expected fear, they expected hesitation, and above all, they expected the Varkel to act as a weapon of chaos rather than an intelligent ally. He whispered, "We don't need to destroy them all. We just need time." The Varkel's gaze flickered toward him, and Rylan understood. They were no longer hunter and prey, they were partners in something larger than either had faced alone. The creature roared, a low, resonant sound that shook the ash around them, and stomped toward the nearest skiff. Its sheer presence forced the vehicle into evasive maneuvers, giving Rylan the chance to activate the star pod's full beacon sequence. Panels slid open along the pod's hull, revealing encrypted logs, video, and forensic data of mercenary crimes. Illegal experiments, fabricated bounties, systemic cover-ups. The beacon's signal wasn't just a distress call, it was irrefutable proof, now streaming across authority frequencies. From the ridge above, additional authority vessels descended, their armor glinting with disciplined authority. The mercenaries froze mid-attack, realizing the calculus had shifted. They were not just facing a predator, they were facing exposure. Rylan's pulse surged. He had always studied patterns, calculated outcomes, sought knowledge over instinct, yet nothing in his academic life had prepared him for the raw thrill of survival interlaced with justice. A single mercenary, desperate and proud, raised a pulse cannon targeting the Varkel. Before he could fire, Rylan leapt, using the terrain to his advantage, kicking the weapon aside. Sparks flew and the mercenary stumbled back. The Varkel surged forward, muscles coiling in a perfect crescendo of lethal elegance. It struck with a controlled blow, enough to disarm without killing. Rylan watched, realizing that the creature's intelligence was more profound than mere instinct. It had chosen restraint because he had taught it, without words, that their goal was exposure, not slaughter. The authority ships deployed containment nets and scanning pulses, corralling the mercenaries. The Varkel moved among them, keeping the hunters at bay with precision strikes, its movements like a predator weaving through the threads of a web it could dismantle at will. Rylan stayed close, his hands hovering near the pod's control interface, heart hammering as he watched the balance of power shift irreversibly. Finally, the mercenaries' resistance collapsed. Engines roared as they retreated under the authority's command, leaving behind scorched soil and the faint scent of ozone. Rylan allowed himself to breathe, leaning against the Varkel, feeling the tremor of its heartbeat through the ground. The creature's gaze softened slightly, the sharpness of predator instinct tempered by acknowledgement of their shared victory. Rylan knelt beside the starpod. Data streams flickered across the interface, evidence of exploitation, falsified reports, and systemic corruption. He scrolled through footage of the Varkel's capture and escape. Each frame told a story of fear, ingenuity, and survival. The creature had not been a mindless killer. It had been a victim, a sentinel, a being forced into the role of legend by human greed. "You're free," Rylan whispered, voice catching in the ash-laden wind. "And they can't hide the truth anymore." The Varkel exhaled a low, vibrating hum that pressed against Rylan's mind. It was more than sound, it was acknowledgement, trust, gratitude. For the first time, Rylan saw the apex predator as more than legend or weapon. It was an intelligent, sentient being with agency and choice. And it had chosen him. The creature stepped closer, brushing a clawed hand against Rylan's shoulder, a gesture of connection that transcended species. In that instant, Rylan understood the magnitude of their bond. This was not partnership born of convenience, it was alliance forged in the crucible of survival, tempered by mutual respect. As the sun's third ray dipped behind the horizon, Rylan and the Varkel stood atop the plateau, the sprawling ash plains stretching beneath them. Below, the authority vessels pulsed with light, securing the area, ensuring that the evidence would reach every corner of the trisolar frontier. Rylan felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders, a human who had dared to intervene, who had seen past legend and fear and had chosen to act. The Varkel emitted a final long resonance, a low harmonic that vibrated through the plateau. Rylan mirrored it with a quiet exhale, a silent promise that he would honor the creature's trust, protect its autonomy, and ensure that the truth remained untarnished. Behind them, the ash plains lay quiet now, scorched but cleansed by the ordeal. The mercenaries were defeated, their lies exposed. Above, 3 suns lingered in the sky, witnesses to a moment of choice, courage, and revelation. Rylan's gaze swept across the horizon. "We made it," he said softly. But he knew it was more than survival. It was transformation. A predator that had silenced empires had chosen not vengeance, but alliance. And humanity, in a single act of courage and insight, had met it as an equal. The Varkel turned its massive head toward him, eyes reflecting the fading light of the suns. In them, Rylan saw a reflection of something rare in the galaxy. Mutual recognition. Respect. Trust. Something stronger than fear or dominance. "Then we move forward," he whispered. The creature's low hum vibrated beneath his feet, an echo of consent, a promise of companionship in the uncharted voids ahead. Together they would navigate what remained of the trisolar frontier, not as hunter and prey, not as alien and human, but as partners, bound by choice, by survival, and by the truth that could no longer be silenced. And as the suns dipped beneath the horizon, their light scattering across the ash-strewn plains, Rylan understood something profound. The universe had offered him a predator, and he had met it with the courage to see its true self. The story of man and apex hunter would be whispered across sectors, a legend of intelligence, restraint, and humanity's rare capacity to honor life even in the presence of unimaginable power. The wind swept across the plateau. The ash stilled. And the predator that had once silenced empires now chose to walk beside a human, not as weapon or slave, but as a companion, a sentinel, and a testament to the courage that defines humanity at its finest.